Now, Hilary finished a PhD last year, in 2007 actually now, so it's a year before last now, looking at some of the things she's going to talk about now, environmental justice in the prophets, Old Testament. So it's a great pleasure to have her talk to us on that now. She's a real expert in that. Before that, she did a BA at King's College in theology, King's College in London. Her previous career, as you might notice, this is a recent career. Her previous career was a degree in social administration from Manchester, and she did lots of interesting things in between. So it's a real pleasure to have somebody that's got such wide experience to talk to us today. So Hilary, over to you.
Thank you. What Bob neglected to say was that I actually work full-time for the Faraday as a researcher in environment and theology, so he is technically my boss. Well, he's actually my boss, not technically, so... Going to be looking at some of the prophetic texts as an example, in a way, of how we might approach the Old Testament with the kind of issues that Bob's been talking about in our minds. And just by way of introduction, this is a government survey, Environment Agency survey. They surveyed 25 leading conservationists, and surprising result, they ranked the 50 things in the order of priority or importance. Number 2 on the list was this: it's time the world's faith groups reminded us we have a duty to restore and maintain the ecological balance of the planet. And it went on to say, Christians, Muslims, Hindus and others already believe it is morally wrong to damage the environment. The problem is that many people, and perhaps they meant many believers, simply choose to ignore this. I felt that was a real wake-up call, actually, for the church. If secular environmentalists are saying, get on board with this, and perhaps especially for those of us here that are planning to be in full-time ministry and in a position to influence those in our congregations. It's not true to say that religion has always been perceived in such a positive way in terms of environmental issues. It's been seen at best as something irrelevant. In many people's opinion, it's actually been seen as culpable, as contributing to the state that the world is in, that it's the fault of religion. And this is a quote by a well-known figure, David Attenborough, and he was interviewed and asked why people behaved as if they were separated from nature. You can see in the Old Testament that the natural world was there to exploit. It was there for their benefit. That has cast a long shadow. And he goes on to say, Judeo-Christians believe, qualifying that, people who lived in the desert believed that nature was hostile. So there's a perception there in the scientific community that actually the Old Testament really presents a view of the world that has us against it, and we are it's there for us to exploit. And his view is derived, I'm sure, from the writings of a well-known historian of science, Lynn White. Some of you will have come across his infamous article in the 1960s, which laid the blame for the environmental crisis that was beginning to surface at the roots of the Judeo-Christian tradition. How do we respond to that? Well, as Bob said, my PhD was looking at some of the prophets of the Old Testament from the perspective of environmental issues, and I've kind of in a way, the Lynn White article and David Attenborough's response has sort of galvanised me in a way in my examination of the text. I suppose even for some Christians, the response will be, well, why bother with the Old Testament? What has the Old Testament to say about what is essentially a modern problem? And perhaps more specifically, how can we derive environmental ethics from the Old Testament? I mean, the whole issue of how we get ethics from the Old Testament anyway, how we do biblical ethics, is a thorny one. As if you've done an ethics course, you've probably we come across. It's not always straightforward when we're trying to evaluate and develop ethical practice biblically. There are lots of questions, not just with regard to environmental ethics. I'm not going to delve into those at great length, but just to remind you, if you haven't already come across this, a lot of people who write about Old Testament ethics, they sort of fall into two camps, really. There are those that say you can only really just describe the ethics of the Old Testament, what went on then, how they thought you should live. You can't do any more than that. It's a world that's kind of gone. It's a world that's no longer relevant to contemporary issues. There are others, and myself included, will say, no, actually, you can read the Old Testament and say there are things there that are normative. There are things there that have carry-on value. There are things we can derive that are relevant for today. If you're interested in that division, there's a little bit in some of you might know Andrew Mean, who's the Old Testament tutor at Westcott, although he's been on study leave for a couple of years. He's written about that at the beginning of his book on Ezekiel, Ethics in Ezekiel. Just to give you an example of two contrasting perspectives that I think reflect those two positions, and this is the two people I've come across who write most specifically on Old Testament ethics as it relates to environmental issues, and they're the only two that devote any major amount of space in their writings to it, at least of published works at the moment. The first is Cyril Rodd, who's written a thematic study going through different areas of ancient Israelite and biblical life, and he has a section on a whole chapter on nature. He would say that what he's doing is just presenting a series of windows on the world of the Old Testament. You're kind of looking, as it were, through a window into a room that you can't actually go into, and therefore you're just an observer from the outside. And he's very, very hotly criticises theologians who try and find an explicitly green message in the Old Testament. And in particular, and I have some sympathy with him, he's very kind of hostile to the sort of what I call the proof texting method, whereby you find a verse, perhaps in Deuteronomy, the one about not taking a mother bird with her eggs but leaving her, or the one about not cutting down fruit trees when you besiege a city, and you develop a green ethic from those verses. You hang everything else around them. And I have some sympathy with his critique of the method, because it seems that you actually can make the text, in some circumstances, and some green authors have done, mean whatever you want it to mean, and it doesn't really have any real relationship with what people thought was going on there. And there's an argument that a lot of the texts that are read environmentally are actually very much more economic and pragmatic in how to live well in the land. He ends up by saying this: the question of safeguarding the environment did not enter their thinking. So he totally repudiates anything that we might do with regard to a green message from the Old Testament. And the contrasting perspective, almost at the opposite end of the scale, is the approach of Chris Wright. And I've put C.J.H. Wright to distinguish him from Chris Wright of the Theological Federation, who many of you will have dealings with over finance and so on. This is an Old Testament theologian and preacher, Chris Wright, who's written several books on Old Testament ethics. And he says this, and I've quoted him at length. He says, ancient Israel may not have been anxious or fearful about the plight of the physical planet in the way we are, for the very good reason that we have made a far greater mess of it than the ancient world ever did. So, to that extent, many aspects of what we would regard as urgent ecological issues were not explicitly addressed within the Old Testament. Nevertheless, the theological principles and ethical implications that they did articulate regarding creation do have a far-reaching impact on how biblically sensitive Christians will want to frame their ecological ethics today. I think Wright's perspective is useful, and he goes on to develop the kind of principles and implications in his own way. I do it in a slightly different way, as you will see. I think his work contributes a great deal to trying to read the Old Testament environmentally. Having said that, I mean, what he does on the basis of this is construct a sort of a biblical theology that goes into the New Testament as well, that is kind of a theology of creation rather than an exegesis of specific texts. And in that respect, of course, if if his theology fits with your theology, you probably like it better than if it doesn't. And the other thing that it doesn't do is connect, particularly, especially with those that are not in the church. So the message is very much for Christians. It's a good message, but it has its limitations. I suppose I've been thinking a little bit about, my own take on this, and it's not in many ways dissimilar from Chris Wright's, but I suppose the things I'd want to say about how you do, in the technical term, if you like, is ecological hermeneutics, is first of all to see it as a two-way conversation, a dialogue. We're reading the text and hoping it will speak to us, but we're actually putting into it our own perspective and our own point of view, our own situation now in the 21st century. And so we're expecting that it will at times speak to us, but at times we'll actually be wanting to sort of, as it were, dialogue into it and finding things that actually don't connect as well as things that do. And in that respect, there's a healthy discontinuity as well as a continuity. A discontinuity with some previous scholarship, some previous views in the church, in church theology. I don't think that's a bad thing, that we actually reread the text and say, actually, it says different things to us than in the past. Another example would be in the whole sort of abolition of slavery debate, where the Christian church had for centuries seen a biblical mandate for their practice of slavery. Now, you might say it was a very misguided one, but they did justify it biblically. And when Wilberforce came along and reread Genesis and thought about what image of God meant and came to realise it didn't actually mean anything other than all people were equal, it fueled his campaign. So that rereading of the text that he and others with him undertook, and that the statue of the guy whose name I forget, whose preaching influenced him, is on the corner of St John's College, on the chapel there. I can't remember what his name is. Can anyone remember? No? Okay, you'll have to go and look for yourself. I keep forgetting his name and people keep having to be reminded of it. And when we are reading the Bible in an environmental framework, we're often challenging previous readings that have been overly anthropocentric and hierarchical, readings that have stressed so much the importance of humanity and justified doing what we want with the world because God's just given it to us to use as we want. We're trying to counter those and counterbalance them in the same way as perhaps in I'd qualify this, some feminist readings are very hostile, but feminist readings often are trying to counterbalance the kind of hierarchical readings that have gone on in church tradition previously. In the environmental arena, the writings of von Rad, whom I'm sure a number of you are familiar with, stressed the story of salvation history, Israel's story of God's dealings with them, to the exclusion in his earlier writing of any theology of creation, to the point where he said creation was secondary and had no importance. He actually revised that later in his life, but he's remembered for being the person that stresses the sort of human story of the biblical text to the exclusion of the broader one of all creation. And in a sense, when we're doing ecological hermeneutics, we're trying to reread the biblical text to counter that and say, well, actually, what does the text have to say about the rest of creation and how it functions and our relationship to it? And the final thing is to be culturally relevant. We're dealing with an issue which is on the general public's mind. It's on the mind of scientists, of people that would not darken the door of the church. And as Bob mentioned, it's an opportunity for us to say, actually, the church does have something to say. We have something to say, and we can connect with this issue. It affects us all, but actually, Christian faith is not irrelevant. And I found it really interesting when I was doing my PhD and I was in sort of, context perhaps of conservation biologists or whatever, which I do sometimes mix in. And I kind of used to just say, when people ask me what my thesis was, I'd just say, well, it's on religion and the environment. And those that kind of hadn't got any time for religion, the shutters would come down and you'd think, okay, move on. But a number of people would press me and say, well, what's that about? And I say, well, I'm actually talking about the text of the Christian church. And if Christians believe that God created the world and therefore we have responsibility for it, and that affects how we should live, and I'm trying to explore that. And you'd see a lot of people think, hey, that's really interesting, that's really relevant. They might not be Christians, but actually explaining that we're concerned about this because of what we believe connects with people. It makes them think, actually, yes, that makes sense. Okay, let's think a little bit more about environmental issues. And I've said that for many people who dismiss the Old Testament, it's because it is a contemporary problem, a modern problem. And in one sense, that is so. And if you wanted to sum up, if you like, in pictorial form, if you wanted to draw a diagram of what's going on, this is very simplistic, but one way you could do it is talk about the loss of connections between us and the world we live in, between people and the natural world, as well as the sort of spiritual loss of connection between people and God that we see all around us. And in some ways it could seem, actually particularly in the West, that our society has meant that we live very separate in our minds from the natural world. This separation between culture and nature has been identified by a number of sort of environmental philosophers as one of the profound problems of Western society. And it manifests itself in kind of trivial ways, like, a group of school children go on a farm and they sort of go, ugh, when they see how milk arrives, because to them it just comes in plastic bottles from Tesco's. That's a symptom of the problem that the loss of connection between our cultures and the natural world has brought about. But of course it's much more profound, because if you're not connected with the seasons, with the rhythms of sowing and harvesting and so on, if it doesn't matter to you whether the rains fail or not and your crops grow, that you have food, you tend to forget that how important it is for those in other parts of the world. We don't have that struggle in our own societies, and it's helped us to be able to detach ourselves from the world in which we live. And I think that's problematic. Okay, so if we're going to read the prophets environmentally, let me just talk about two perspectives, and I guess I probably do a mixture of both when I do my reading of texts. And the first is sort of a bringing together of this nature-culture separation, that in the biblical world, actually, as in non-industrialised, non-urban people throughout the world, the overlap is much closer, that the connection between human society and the natural world is there. You rely on the natural world for your resources. Whether you use them wisely or not is another matter. But as I said, if the rains fail, because actually your crop shrivels in the field, and it's a much closer connection. It was true in all pre-technological societies. It's still true for a lot of the world today, and it certainly is reflected in the biblical prophets. Whether the overlap is a place of blessing and well-being or a place of tension and conflict is a whole different issue as well, as we shall see. But the overlap is there. A second biblical perspective, I've taken this from Chris Wright's book, sees God and all creation in a kind of a triangular framework, whereby the relationships or interconnections exist between God, and his creation, between God and the non-human creation, between God and the human creation, and human and non-human. It's a slightly cumbersome phrase, non-human creation, but it becomes more a bit of a problem to know what to say. Nature isn't a word that is a very biblical word. We know what it means, but it has all sorts of Greek philosophical overtones, as well as being quite a broad term. So I stick with the cumbersome, I'm afraid. We could say the earth, if you like, but we are part of the earth, so it's a useful distinction. And obviously within the realm of human society, relationships within that society. And what it seems to me, when you look at the prophets in particular, with this framework in mind, you see areas over and over again where those points have been broken, where those relationships are fragmented, where there's a breakdown in relationship between people and the rest of creation, as there is between people and God. And I think that I've certainly discovered some new insights as I've done so. I hope you will. Let me just illustrate it from a short passage in Hosea, and from now on we are going to be getting really into some texts in quite a bit more depth, so we'll be rattling through them, I'm afraid, but the references are there. You can look them up yourself. But here you have in verse 1, Hosea indicting the people for forgetting God, their fundamental loss of connection with their God. And then, of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a net result in society: swearing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. No coincidence that those 5 kind of things going on in society actually reflect the second half of the Decalogue very closely, not exactly, but very closely. There's a breakdown in society as a result of the failure of their relationship with God. But then, and perhaps this is where it gets more unusual, Hosea makes a very clear link with what's going on in the rest of the world. Therefore, it's very strong in the Hebrew, therefore the land mourns and all who live in it languish. And that isn't just the crops that the people depend on, it's the wild animals, the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. It's intriguing perhaps to reflect what was in the mind of the prophet when he wrote those words. Undoubtedly it was not the kind of environmental disasters that we are seeing. And yet, when we read them from our perspective and we read back into them with our context in mind, we see actually, in one sense, he was a very prophetic prophet. I mean, what he's talking about, this loss of connection, not just a spiritual one between people and God, or even a societal one, but one which affects the whole of the created order, is one that we're seeing reflected time and time again in our world. So it's a model for the world we're living in. And as Ecclesiastes says, there is nothing new under the sun. And perhaps this is an example of that. I'm going to use this triangular model to explore more fully the whole area of texts which are to do with justice. I've chosen to focus on justice and the biblical prophets. There are lots of different texts you could use, but I just wanted to focus in on some of the prophetic texts. And we're going to be looking at how the worship of God connects with human society and then with the earth in more detail. Just a few things about prophets and justice in general. And the prophets were very concerned about God's order in the world. The theme of divine order in the world is one that you'll see echoed through and through again in the Old Testament. And the prophets were very concerned about it, if you like. It was one of their core premises, that there was a way that the world was meant to be, that God fundamentally initiated and that people often abrogated and ignored. And that, for many of the prophets, particularly the earlier prophets, is manifested in the phrase justice and righteousness, in the concepts of justice and righteousness, Hebrew mishpat and zedakah. which encapsulates more than just kind of dealing out good judgments in a law court. It encapsulates the sense of the well-being, the order in the world, the order of society. But for the prophets, justice in the law courts does matter. Ethical standards matters as an outworking of that, but it's not the whole deal. They're concerned with the whole picture, with shalom, which is another word, along with justice and righteousness, peace. It's broader than the term in English conveys. It conveys a wholeness, a well-being of society. And some of the times that these words are brought together are very instructive to understand their vision of society and also how it had gone wrong. Let me just illustrate from the book of Micah, fairly familiar passage. He's told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. Setting out an agenda for the people, for Israelite society, one might say for Christian society. In fact, this was probably one of the first verses I ever heard preached on when I joined a church, and for some reason it impacted me then, and it's always been one of my favourites, but it's very relevant to today. The context of that verse in Micah is, how do I come to God? What is worship? What does it mean to come before God? And he's basically answering the question that no, God's not really concerned about the quantity. He's actually not interested in the numbering of offerings you make if you're a good Jew. He's not interested in you offering up your firstborn son to appease him. But what he goes on to talk about, Prophet Micah, is God's voice against injustice, against weighted scales, a bag of dishonest weights, the wealthy oppressing the poor. It seems that actually, no matter how many offerings the Israelites bring to God, whilst this kind of thing is going on in their cities, God is not interested. So the section about bringing offerings is about how people worship God. Here we're talking about interpersonal relationships in society, how society conducts itself. And this is the consequence of that failure of justice. Sickness and the desolation of the land. The failure of the land to produce the produce and the well-being that Israel had been led to expect. It's a very kind of telling comment in verse 15, isn't it? You shall sow but not reap. You shall tread olives but not anoint yourselves with oil. You shall tread grapes but not drink wine. It's the consequences of ignoring God's ethical standards in society have an outworking in the land. And those two words I've put in brackets, the Hebrews chala and shamam, occur again and again in prophetic texts, talking about the relationship between people and God and the land. I'm just going to look at a few other texts which have similar echoes. Isaiah 1, very familiar one. Again, how do you worship God? Is it just bringing lots of sacrifices? Trample my courts no more. No, that isn't the answer. Why? Because actually the people are exploiting those less privileged than themselves. They need to cleanse themselves of that social injustice before their worship is acceptable to God. It's not okay to do one thing towards God and be at the same time abusing those that are less privileged than them. And if we look earlier in the chapter, the outworking in the land and among the people. The whole head is sick, chala, that word again. The whole heart faint is a metaphorical description of the sickness of Israel because of the sickness of their society. And then he goes on to say, your country lies desolate, Shalman, your cities are burned by fire. It is desolate. Desolation and sickness as a result of the people's failure to deal with their own society's issues. And a final one, again, we've got, in Amos 5, we've got worship not being about which shrine you go to, where you go to worship, not about how often or how devout you are, because actually you've turned justice to wormwood and brought righteousness to the ground. Very strident prophetic indictment again of injustice. Again, the echo is similar to Micah. Because you've done this, there will be futility in your own planting of crops and building of houses and so on. They will be taken away from you. What's the consequences for the rich? Thinking in terms of a society which is very, very polarised, probably in 8th century Israel, between the wealthy landowners and the poor who perhaps were once landowners but have been dispossessed for a variety of reasons. There is an echo of hope in the Amos passage that we need to hold on to, because this isn't all about gloom. The echo of hope for those that change, and we will be talking about this whole area of hope a little bit later on. But I want to just talk about an ethical implication which you may or may not have noticed, but we do need to think about this. The prophets often envisage a catastrophic destruction of the land, and a flood or an earthquake as being God's punishment for the injustice. In Amos and Isaiah texts, it's likened to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But it kind of has some implications if we're thinking about the poor and needy being the ones who need to benefit from justice. Is it really just of God to wipe out the land on which presumably they were at least gleaning from the edges? There are implications for the poor and needy, and perhaps implications for the land as well. Some sort of strands of ecological hermeneutics would see it as a bit of a problem that the land keeps getting destroyed or near destroyed or disrupted, and that the biblical picture is really one in which the land, the well-being of the earth, doesn't really matter. You can decide whether you think that's a valid question or not. But I want to just explore those a little bit, each in turn. Now, what does it mean, justice for the poor, in the biblical context of these prophets? Because actually these natural disasters that seem to be the fruit of God's judgment are the things that affect the poor most, as we've already heard from Bob. And actually, I had when the tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, was it, or 5? 4? Happened, I was in a small group, sort of Bible study group, and one guy started to wax lyrical about how this was God's judgment on the sex trade in East Asia. And I was so incensed, I was kind of sort of having to swallow my kind of apoplexy and work out a way of correcting him very gently, but really letting him know that I wasn't at all enamoured of this simplistic understanding. But in some ways you could see how he might simplistically read the text and come to that conclusion. I've got 2 points I want to say. The first is, as I've said, I think these texts are addressed to the poor, to the rich. I think this is the rich elite in society. They're the ones actually that have access to reading. They're the ones that have access to learning. They're the ones that have access and the ability to be able to hear. I think the prophets are targeting their indictment to the rich in society. There's a sense of levelling the ground, of restoring balance. If they won't do it willingly, God will. And the second thing to say, and this follows on from that the tradition in the biblical narrative is of the land as a sacred gift from God, the land given to God by God to the people to be distributed evenly amongst them. The rules of Jubilee meant that any land that was sold or given up was supposed to be returned. Not sure that ever operated, and certainly in 8th century Israel and Judah that wasn't operating. But there's this sense that actually the land is a sacred gift and there are responsibilities inherent in that. And if you abuse those responsibilities, actually the land will cease to provide for you. If you read in Deuteronomy, I think it's 28 and around there, the list of blessings and cursings as the people enter the land, and if they are obedient to God, the fruitfulness that will ensue, and if they're disobedient, the way that the land will wither. You'll get a picture of what the prophet is trying to encapsulate in his message. I think too of the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21, where the king wants the vineyard and he tries to persuade Naboth to sell it, and Naboth says basically, not on your life, this is my family's inheritance, heaven forbid that I should sell it to you. And there's this strong sense that actually the inheritance matters, the family matters, the family tradition matters. That, I think, has gone in the society that the prophets are addressing, and therefore they are speaking out against that. And we also have to recognise the presence of hyperbole in a lot of the prophetic texts, that they are presenting forcefully, they're like the impassioned preachers, and I'm sure none of you ever do it in your preaching, but preachers are known to exaggerate sometimes, and often with good reason, because they've got captivated by the message that they see and they're wanting to communicate it in an impassioned way. So the prophets are not immune to that kind of hyperbole. What about the land? Is another question, a way of framing the question, does the land actually have any intrinsic value in these texts, or is it just a sort of a foil for the human story? Is von Rad right after all, that actually the land is fairly incidental and there's no understanding of its importance in its own right? And of course, the question about intrinsic value, you may be aware, is one that environmentalists ask, and environmental philosophy asks a lot. And there are divergent views within the world of secular sort of conservationists as to whether actually what you're doing is preserving environments in order to ensure that human beings have enough to continue to exist, or whether you actually think it's important to preserve a part of the world where no one will ever go, where there's no obvious benefit to humanity, but you actually think it's got intrinsic value, that you need to preserve it or look after it or make sure it's okay. All sorts of other complicated issues as to whether you actually intervene to preserve something that's under threat or not, and whether you just leave it to be, and so on, which we aren't going to go into here, but are fascinating questions. Perhaps we can talk about over lunch if you're interested. I suppose my answer from the biblical perspective would, and I'm going broader than the prophets here, would be to say there is this sense of purposefulness in the natural world. Bob's already referred to both these texts, that it has a purpose that is outside of just what it does for us. There's a sense too, and particularly it comes through in the book of Amos, but also in Psalm 19, that the natural world actually reveals something of God's glory. It bears something of God's glory that it reveals. And if the natural world, if parts of the natural world go, then you could say that actually the ability of it to reflect aspects of God is also gone. Creation reveals something of God. In some of the Psalms, we're told that creation praises God, the rest of creation praises God. Psalm 150 talks about, I think it's trees of the field, clap your hands, and so on. The animals praising God. when you get to Psalm 114:8, it's interesting because it's even inanimate creation is said to praise God. Mountains and hills, I think it's actually trees are there as well. The psalmist isn't really interested in how that happens, in the sort of philosophical questions that raises. He's actually just concerned that all creation should be able to praise God. If we destroy bits of it wantonly with no thought for it, what are we doing to creation's ability, all of our ability to praise God? And then, as we saw in the Hosea text, we're told that the creation mourns as well. Creation mourning it. And that crops up in, I think there's 9 texts in the prophets that talk about some aspect of the creation mourning. There's a couple in Isaiah, several in Jeremiah. So this idea actually that the whole creation mourns when things are not right in the world, in the bigger picture, seems to give it, in my mind, a sense of value that is more than just what we need it for, what we do with it. And I want to illustrate this by looking at a text in Isaiah. Actually, is my time nearly up? It is.
No,
have I got plenty of time? What time did I start?
It's got 10 minutes.
Okay, right, brilliant. Okay, I just want to look at this and just give you an example of what you might call an ecological reading that is looking at this text through a sort of ecologist's eyes. I'm not claiming that it's the only way to read it, but it's an interesting perspective. And Isaiah 34, as we will see, is a judgment text. It's not sure who it's addressed to. Some translations supply, I think it's Edom, but the actual Hebrew doesn't. But you'll see the elements of God's judgment when we look at the text. His judgment includes soil degradation, the streams of Eden. Yes, the NRSV includes Eden, but that isn't in the Hebrew, so it's an interpretive insertion. Her soil into sulphur, her land shall become burning pitch. So good soil becomes unable to sustain life and agriculture. Then we get the whole aspect of depopulation. And actually, a lot of these things are reflected in modern day ecological disasters, in things that happen. You have soil degradation, you then have depopulation. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. No one shall pass through it forever and ever. So this idea that land becomes desolate because the soil cannot sustain the population. And those 2 words in the brackets of the Hebrew, we'll come back to those. You'll see why I flagged those up here. Soil degradation, depopulation, and what I've called the unmaking of creation. What do I mean by that? He shall stretch out the line of confusion over it, and the plummet of chaos over its nobles. They shall name it no kingdom there, and all its princes shall be nothing. And those words in bracket, tohu and bohu, are the 2 words used in the beginning of the Genesis creation account to describe the world as formless and void, or whatever the translations are, empty and a waste. So a lot of commentators actually suggest that this is deliberately echoing that, because actually the combination of those 2 words together is only, I think, one other place in the Old Testament where it occurs. Deliberately echoing the Genesis account and talking about the unmaking of creation here. But, as, again, commentators point out, it's not as simple as that, because although it seems to be echoing and being a reversal of the Genesis creation account, actually what happens is an alternative ecology develops, which doesn't involve the human population. So in a way, it's only from the human perspective that it's been unmade. So you get all these different animals turning up there: hawk, hedgehog, owl, raven. Actually, if you read different translations, the animal names are often different, because a lot of the time we don't know actually what the Hebrew refers to, because it only occurs here, or and often you have to guess, or no, use intelligent scholarship to get to that. No, you have to guess. Some people have to guess. But notice actually in verse 17, again, I put the Hebrew words in there, that actually the alternative ecology is that these people, these animals, these creatures have it as their right forever. From generation to generation, they shall live in it. Oops, gone too far. And actually, what it's echoing is this sense that we do not need to presume that our security in the world is guaranteed, and that actually even that God is going to make everything come out all right for us who are Christians, or for human society at the expense of the rest of the world. That actually there's, I suppose I'd sum it up in the phrase, I don't think that in the world of sort of conservation, we are not the sort of default mode of the universe. If humans disappear, then actually a lot of other life forms will still go on living. In the sort of biblical world, this cautions us against presuming that everything's just going to work out right for everybody, and particularly for those who believe in God. It's a bit of a naive presumption, I think, and we need to guard against it. I wanted to ask the question about how God acts today, which is a huge kind of theological issue that I can't go into too much, and it has great implications. But because, again, translating from then to now is difficult. I mean, we've already touched this a little bit about modern day natural disasters, and there's a sense in which we have to, what I call, mind the gap. If you've been on a tube train when they said that as you get off the platform, there is a gap. We need to recognise the gap, and particularly the gap is in scientific understanding of how the world works, what causes earthquakes, and I won't go into that territory too much because it's Bob's, but I've learnt a lot about that since working with him. The science of tectonic plates is something we are privileged to have, which the ancients didn't. So there is a gap between how they view the world and how we do. And there's a sense in which I see it as God letting creation unfold in the way that it does. I found this quote by Vinath Ramachandra very, very illuminating and sobering as well. The creation unfolds, God has a letting it be. And that is sobering for us when we're thinking about environmental issues, because I think it means that God doesn't sort of step in to wave a magic wand. We're bearing the fruit of what we do, how we, as part of the creation, live our lives, and how we deal with the rest of the world. I think we need some of the ancient wisdom that the wisdom writers of the Bible talked of in order to learn to live wisely in the world. I want to take the last 5 minutes, though, to put another perspective, and that is the perspective of hope, because it can be very easy for us to get totally depressed by all this and to feel powerless and just to freeze like a rabbit in the headlights. I read a really, really interesting interview with Tony Juniper, who was until quite recently Friends of the Earth CEO, and he was asked by the interviewer whether he had hope that anything could be better. You know, he'd gone through all these scenarios and he talked about the problems, and he just had a one line. He said, yeah, if I had no hope, I wouldn't get up in the morning and go to work every day. And I thought, well, you know, he has hope, as far as I know, no particular religious reasons for that. He has to have hope because it gives him a momentum for doing what he's doing. I think we have much bigger reasons for hope, and I think the prophets talk about those, which don't exonerate us from responsibility, but they do give us a sense that actually that it's not a futile doing what we're doing today, doing whatever we can to make things different. And I'm going to go through several texts again and talk about how the vision for hope pans out in those different areas of society. Isaiah 29 begins with the fruitfulness of the land. Lebanon become a fruitful field. and the fruitful field be regarded as a forest. The sense that the restoration of something that had been lost. But alongside that restoration of the natural world comes restoration of justice in society. And healing. Do you remember the theme of sickness and desolation of the land that came in earlier in Isaiah? So you've got this sense of restoration of fruitfulness, restoration of justice in society, healing of, I don't know if this is physical or metaphorical that the prophet's talking about. You can argue the case. Then in Isaiah 30, this is the Lord as a God of justice rising up to be gracious to those who wait for him. And the result is that the idolatry that Israel, Judah was so prone to goes away, that true worship comes in instead. And the result is again fruitfulness, fertility of the ground. It will be rich and plenteous. And the final one I want to end with this text, very, very familiar words. Just let me highlight one or two features of them. The first is that the passage in Isaiah 11 is bracketed by the restoration of the knowledge of the Lord. And remember in Hosea it was the absence of knowledge that has led to the undoing of society and the undoing of creation, if you like. But the restoration of the knowledge of the Lord. And we're not talking here about sort of intellectual assent, we're talking about a relational knowledge of God being restored. And the twofold restoration is in terms of ethics and justice, the poor, righteousness, faithfulness, justice, judging with equity for the meek of the earth. And bracketing that alongside that, this slightly intriguing hope for the change in the physical natural world, in the relationship between people and the natural world. Now, if we try and read this passage in the light of sort of kind of what we know about predators and prey and so on in terms of evolutionary biology, it causes some problems, and I don't want to go into that there. I think it's a metaphorical, rich metaphorical rather than a literal picture of shalom, of the idea of shalom that is going to be restored. Okay, so in summary, what do I think we can learn from the prophets? Well, lots and lots of things, but I've picked out a few. The first is that human behaviour has impacts on the earth. The way we behave impacts the world. I think that's there in the prophets. We know it's true today. The second is this cause and effect thing, that actions have consequences, that the way we behave now affects future generations, it affects people in the other side of the world. The prophets were very aware of this sequence of cause and effect, that nothing is without its knock-on effects. We're accountable to God, just as the ancient Israelites were, I believe, for the way that we treat the poor, the way that we live with respect to those that are less privileged than us. And in our global society, it's not just the people that sit begging outside our city gates, as it would have been in ancient Israel, it's people the world over. I think we have to value all the earth, not just the bits of it that we find useful or interesting, but all of it. I think the prophets talk a lot about what true worship is, and it's a heart thing, but it has its knock on it. Part of that is behaviour, is ethics. I don't think we can narrow worship down to a liturgy we say on a Sunday, or a sermon we preach. Worship seems to me, or songs we sing, worship seems to me to have ethical implications through and through. Prophets are very clear on that. The final thing, in a way, that it seems to me we need to take away from these prophets is to be challenged to be prophetic voices ourselves. And in whatever sphere we're in, I mean, you going to lead churches will have opportunities to take people with you on issues that matter. And I think that we need a lot of prophetic voices within the church and outside it, raising these issues, talking about them, encouraging other people to get involved. I often think that if the prophet Amos was actually preaching today, he would be speaking out against environmental abuses as much as he would against social injustice, because I think that the prophets had a unique ability to get hold of something in the heart and mind of God that was contemporary and relevant and a burning issue of their day, and to speak unequivocally about it. So let's be prophetic voices. And the final thing is to remember that we do have a hope. We are people of hope. If we have no hope, then, as paraphrasing Paul, then there is no future for us. I like the mustard seed theology articulated by Tom Sine, and he uses the analogy of the mustard seed and the parable of the mustard seed, that it's the tiniest of seed, yet out of it grows a big tree, to say, let's do what we can, where we can, and be part of something much bigger. And the encouragement from him is to be part of something by the way that we take small steps in our own lives and way we influence other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. Well, we have some time for questions. Yeah.
We heard Amos effectively preach this morning in morning prayer in the lectioning about raining down destruction on Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
How much of what the prophets say is just about Israel and the future vision of Shalom in Israel, over and above kind of more of a global effort towards ecology? And how much are we kind of guilty of burying ourselves in writings of the past rather than reading the book of creation as it is now?
In terms of the second half of your question, I think that it's a both and rather than either or. I mean, I think that reading the book of creation, as you so eloquently put it, in other words, learning from the world that God has made around us, reflecting on it, enjoying it, is part of what we need to do, and I wouldn't want to minimise that. I think, I tried to sort of say this at the beginning, we do have to recognise that the context is very different. The context of Amos' oracles against the nations is a very specific one, and I think it's dangerous and wrong to kind of use that to justify anything that's happening in the political sphere today. I think we have to do a broader thing, which is go to the principles at work and try and draw them out, if you like, and that's what I've been trying to do. Say that there's this connection. Say that actually, actions have consequences. If you're thinking about, it's interesting, the oracles against the nations, which are chapter 1 through to verse 5 of chapter 2, are interesting because they don't have the same engagement with the natural world that the rest of Amos has. They're quite unique in their own take, and I'm sure if you heard them did you all hear on Amos this morning? Okay, right. What's interesting is that if you think of them in terms of ethics, and John Barton has argued this quite strongly in his little book, that actually they seem to assume a global ethical standard that would be acceptable to all peoples of the time. They seem to be sort of doing something more than just setting up the standard of Yahweh, the God of Israel, against the other gods of the other nations. There's a sense that there's a principle there that they were trying to articulate, that actually this is counter to what any right-minded individual would think was acceptable behaviour. So perhaps we can mine them for that. And I actually think that the oracles of Amos, kind of, if you think of the Geneva Convention on war crimes, there's quite a lot of common ground there about what's going on. But I don't know if that answers your question about how to read it.
Other questions? Any comments? Yeah.
You're working mainly with Hebrew or English text?
Well, I use the Hebrew as a starting point, and then here I think I mainly use the NRSV translation.
I'm sure you knew the text before, so for your PhD studies you reread it through the whole prophecies. You read it, the entire text for your studies.
I've read considerable. I wouldn't say I've read the whole text, but certainly not in Hebrew anyway. And so I read quite a bit of it. Yeah.
Hi there. How would you comment on the disconnect between, for instance, the prophecies saying, you were saying they're mainly applied to the rich and were a levelling of the ground. It seems at the minute, if there was a prophecy about the rich West, it seems actually the ground is being levelled for sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. There seems to be a disconnect there. How would you comment on that?
I think it is a disconnect. I think actually it's almost a reversal, if you like, that what you see in the prophets is the neglect of justice and righteousness has a knock-on effect on the wealth of the people, because their land is less fruitful. I mean, in a way, the opposite is true. We've abused the land so that it is no longer fruitful, and that has a knock-on effect on the poor and on justice issues. So I suppose I feel it's just kind of, there are almost two ways of saying the same very simple thing, that actually actions have consequences, and the way that we behave has enormous consequences, not just for ourselves, but for the rest of the world, and particularly for those that are less privileged. But I agree. I mean, if you do a sort of literalist mindset on it, you see there is discontinuity there. But I also see that that's part of a bigger whole. That actually actions, consequences, this cycle of cause and effect.
Do you think we're judged through almost a dehumanisation of the West, if you like?
Absolutely. I mean, it seems that actually we bear the results of some of the way we've lived in just, we see them in society panning out. It's I'm just trying to think. This idea that actually, if you go on doing something often enough, you pay, you pay the price for it, you pay the results of it. And I think that sadly the economic crunch has not really made people come to their senses, but you kind of feel it should, in a way, that actually, the economic downturn should make people stop and think, actually, what are we doing, and how have we come so far from sort of, certainly in this country, the kind of ethical values and moral values that perhaps we might have, look back and see were more evident in previous eras. So.
Well, I noticed that I've got a friend who says we talk about the developed world and the undeveloped world, as we often do, and if you listen carefully, I didn't use those phrases. I talk about high-income countries and low-income countries, because he says, a lot of so-called undeveloped countries in Africa, for instance, have much stronger relational strength in their family and wider family and community structures than we have. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of what's happened in the West. I think we've broken down a lot of that relational structure, and I think a lot of what's going on now is because of that. We don't mind usurious rates of interest because we don't see the people that suffer, that sort of thing. We're very individualistic. And actually, I think that's another region that the church, Christian community, should be speaking strongly into. The British society is very individualistic. I guess it dates back to at least Margaret Thatcher, who said there's no such thing as society. And I think we can be speaking powerfully against that. Actually. And I think that's one of the fruits of our behaviour over the last century.
I think the tragedy is that in the quest for economic wealth in many global south countries, the trend is towards sort of urbanisation and perhaps trying to emulate, some of the things that have happened in the West. And of course, the danger of, sometimes urbanisation is enforced for economic reasons, and sometimes it's desired because it's seen as a gateway to greater wealth and so on. And the sort of net effect of that can be this kind of separation of people from their world, the sort of removal from the land that sustains them. So it's quite a complex area, but the danger is to view economic development as the only good, instead of perhaps one amongst many that also needs to be treated with caution. So.
Yeah, we just crossed the threshold where more people live in cities than rurally, globally, happened last year. Any other comments or questions?
I was just thinking, what you're talking reminded me of was that I think there was an Old Testament understanding that the light of the world was from God, not from the sun, and the idea that the light, in that, when you reflect on that light from God, it leads into justice and proper living and connections. And sort of fulfilled in Jesus, who said, I am the light of the world too.
Okay.
And the new creation will be illumined by God's glory. I think that's part of it. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? I can feel tummy's rumbling. Of my own, anyway. No? Good, well there'll be lots of time to talk informally, so let's thank Hilary again, and then you're going to give a notice about how to get to it.
Yeah.